So copyrights are another form of intellectual property. It's provided by the laws of the United States. It has its own code. And it's to the authors of original works of authorship, and this includes literary, dramatic, musical, artistic, and it could be photography, videography. A lot. We associate copyrights primarily with the creative arts, and it's really about creativity when you talk about copyrights. Now we do apply copyrights to, if someone writes up a manual and words, things like that, things that may not be considered to be quote unquote creative, but as a general rule, it's more in the creative side of things. So what does that mean? So we just talked about a copyright or a trademark, right? That's a picture that can be registered. That can also become a copyright, so you can have overlap. So you can have a copyright on your design, and you can also have a trademark as long as it's associated with a good or service. So there can be overlap. You're not going to get a copyright for the labeling. Well, let me rephrase that. Copyright does not have to be associated with a product or a good or service. Once you create something and you put pen to paper, as we like to say, you have a copyright on it. Now we have a federal statute which allows you to get a federally registered copyright, which we'll get into in a minute, which gives you some more options. The key term I like to put here is fair use. And the reason I like that is because that's that big asterisk that gets put next to all copyrights, because if you watch the news and you watch how maybe they take a play that's showing and do a narrative on it, and they're reporting against it. They don't have the right from the play to show that they're violating a copyright, but it falls under one of the fair use exceptions. So satire falls under it, reporting on news, education. So there's a variety of different things that fall as exceptions, so where you don't have to get a license or don't have to get permission to use the copyright. But outside of that, you do need permission or you're violating that. So examples, you got Mickey Mouse, you've got Stephen King writes whether it's his book cover or his book, both are copyrights. You have Lord of the Rings movies, you have Led Zeppelin, you have songs, it's things like that. So all of those things are examples of copyrights. So again, you have common law upon creation. You have registered trademarks, which are federal only in that respect. Copyrights and patents exclusively fall under the federal jurisdiction. Trademarks can fall under state, as we discussed already, and so do trade secrets, we'll get to in a bit. There's also a level of international copyrights as well under the Berne Convention. It's more of a framework for what constitutes a copyright, and people have signed on to say, okay, if you have a copyright in one area, we're going to honor it in another kind of thing. So it helps to kind of link those two things together. And so, when you have somebody violating and reproducing things in China, they're technically breaking the law because they've agreed to enforce it now. A lot of times they're not right now, which has been a big thing for the motion picture industry and things like that. But legally speaking, they do have a copyright that they can enforce on that. Now, when you register it, that becomes, again, it gives you more teeth. So if you create something, someone comes by and takes it and reproduces it and puts it out there, whether they're claiming it's to be their own or not, they could give credit to you and still reproduce it. That's still not okay unless it's a fair use exception. So for example, you write a book, I take that book and I reproduce it and I start selling it. So that now I'm violating a copyright. Well, if it's just a common law copyright, then you're basically going to be limited to whatever profits that you can prove that you lost because of what I did. So it becomes a little bit tricky in that respect. You're still entitled to it, but it's still a little bit trickier. When you register it as a federal trademark, you now get minimum damages that get associated with that. You also get attorney's fees that get associated with that as well. So the bite is a lot harder when it comes down on that. And so if you can show that they violated a federal copyright, your ability to get damages, collect, and get attorney's fees paid for is much higher. So there's a lot of benefit to that as well. How do I get a copyright? Create literally anything. This is the creative part of intellectual property. As soon as you put pen to paper, you get it, and then when you register it with the Copyright Office or using the Berne Convention, which is the international treaty that associates commonalities of copyrights throughout multiple countries. Here's where we talk about the fair use. So I wanted to put these in here because I think this is important. So transformative is one of the exceptions. Transformative means is I take your idea, I take your creation, and I transform it. So it's different. That's okay. You can do that. You can take a picture and you can mock it up, and now it's different, and that's okay. That's not violating it. You can comment on it. So you can, this is kind of that news part of it, right? So you can make comments of it, So here's the new movie out. Let me show you a brief clip, and let me comment on it, right? Parody. So, South Parks are a great example of that, or where they do a parody of it, right? So they take the existing song and then they make fun of it, or they show the artwork and they make fun of it. That's a parody, that's an exception. Education is exactly that, education. So if you're in a classroom and, just think about how difficult our society would be if you were trying to educate somebody on a historical event through the eyes of maybe a historian, and you had to go get a copyright from them, permission to use their copyright in order to present it to class, right? The difficulties would be very hard, right? So, these exceptions have a thought behind them. They're not just, random. Some of them come from a free speech perspective, which is your parody and your news. Some come from just, helping society progress, which is the education component. And then the transformative is more of the, it really is, it's a different piece of material at that point, right? And so you're building upon it. So they don't want to stop that as well. Otherwise, you got to have permission to use the copyright, or you can get in trouble. So one example I worked on was Tracy Morgan was in a car accident one time. And so there was a photographer who took a picture of that. It got reprinted all over the place. There were some attorneys that were using it to get some personal injury business. So there was a handful of them around the country that took it and threw it up on a blog and just said, use it to try to get business, basically. Well, this guy who took the picture basically came after them and said, you're violating my copyright. And so they all had to remove it. Now, this gentleman had decided to go a little bit farther and was trying to kind of shake them all down for money. Didn't go about it in the most ethical way. But that being said, he did have a legitimate copyright because he took the photo. It was his photo. He took it for the New York Times. So the way it worked is him and the New York Times had concurrent ownership of it. And so, but he had that copyright. So if you're going to reproduce it and you're not going to get permission and it's outside of those fair use exceptions, then, don't be surprised if you get a call or get a letter.